Well, thank you very much, Sam, for that kind introduction and for inviting me to be here at all. I feel like a bit of a fifth wheel, I suppose, because I'm a scientist, not an urbanologist per se, although much of my work has focused on cities in the relatively recent past. What I want to talk about is really densify or else. We don't really have any choice in the matter because of the nature of cities. And by the nature of cities, I'm speaking in a fashion that hasn't really been referenced much today at all. It's impossible, it seems to me, as a scientist, to think of cities abstracted from the biophysical context in which they have evolved. And there's been almost no reference today to that biophysical context, either globally or indeed the geopolitical context, which is now obviously important as well. The second major point I want to make is that cities themselves are biophysical or organic entities that eat, breathe, and create vast quantities of waste. And the third point is that what we think of as the city is only a tiny fraction of the total human urban ecosystem. So while I think the counter is a wonderful way of understanding how we're eating up the landscape, it represents only a tiny fraction of the total quantity of landscape on the planet now dedicated to sustaining the city. And that's going to be the main point I will get at here. Why am I not going forward? All right, what am I doing wrong? This one? There we go. So to begin the bit about context, this is a picture of human population growth on planet Earth. I could extend it to the left several thousand years. The main point to take from this is that what we take to be the norm, a period of exponential growth, has only been a couple of hundred years old, a tiny fraction of a % of the total history of humankind. We live in the single most anomalous period in the history of our species, one characterized by explosive population growth and, of course, explosive growth of just about everything else. Here are a selection of graphs showing how other things have similarly grown exponentially as incomes and consumption by human beings has increased in the last 150 years or so. If we think of this in terms of the demands made on the planet, that's what I have attempted to do with the ecological footprint, we convert all of these flows of energy and material into and out of cities into a calculation of the amount of productive ecosystems required to produce those resources and to assimilate the waste generated by production and consumption in the city itself. So the ecological footprint of a city or a country or even the world is simply a measure of the total area of productive land and waterscape dedicated to sustaining and absolutely necessary to sustain that population at its current level of demand in perpetuity, wherever on Earth that landscape may be located. So if we look at cities across the world, from rich to poor, one thing stands out, and that is that the ecological footprint, the demand that people make on the landscape outside of the city, is vastly larger in high-income countries than it is in high or rather low-income countries and cities. Each of you here in this audience, if you're a typical Canadian, is attached by an umbilical cord of commerce to about 7 hectares of biologically productive land and waterscape scattered all over the planet, needed to produce just for you the resources you consume and to assimilate particularly the carbon waste that you generate in the process of that production and consumption. So what this means is that the city is a tiny fraction of the land dedicated to sustaining the city. And we really have to ask ourselves then whether our definition of the urban system isn't somewhat warped. I'll come back to that in a moment. We have to understand also that through urbanization, or not urbanization, but globalization, we've enabled various countries vastly to exceed the biocapacities of their own domestic territories. In fact, many countries now, most high-income, wealthy, high-density urbanized cities now live on vastly more land outside of their boundaries than is contained within them. For example, Japan needs about 7 times as much land and water ecosystem in other countries and in the global commons than is located within Japan. The same for the Netherlands, most countries in Europe, and so on and so on. We say then that all of these countries are in a state of overshoot. They are in ecological deficit with respect to their domestic capacity to sustain themselves. And this can only go on so long as trade remains a possibility. The problem is that with globalization, countries, cities can continue to grow and to consume, oblivious of the impacts of that growth and consumption on elsewheres around the world. So fish stocks are collapsing, soils are being eroded, tropical forests are degrading. Wherever we look, we see a decline in the availability of resources needed to sustain the growing urban populations. We've scarcely made reference to that population growth problem, but think of it in these terms. In the first 40 years of this century, the world's urban population will increase by more people than lived on the entire planet up to the point about 1935. Urban growth in 40 years will add more people to cities than were added to the entire world in the course of human history up till 1935. That's an astonishing urban migration, in-migration of people from countryside to city. But it doesn't mean we're abandoning the landscape, and that's my major point. In fact, we are using the landscape in the hinterland vastly more intensively now to support cities, because as people move to cities, incomes increase, per capita consumption increases, and therefore the ecological footprints of rich urbanites is vastly larger than those of relatively poor rural people. The problem is we're now drawing down the very ecosystems, the stocks of natural capital needed to sustain urban life, and we will reach the point ultimately, should this trend continue, where the viability of the ecosystems that support us is under threat and will no longer be able to sustain growth as we know it. Many other countries, scientists have picked up on this kind of model. This is an example from Sweden. At the University, or Stockholm University, they examined the 29 largest cities in the Baltic States regions of that part of the world in Northern Europe. What they found was that the amount of landscape needed to sustain those cities varies between 500 roughly and 1,100 times larger than the urban area themselves. So for every square kilometer of urbanized land, that's that little square in the center, we see a huge area of productive landscape on the left and a much larger area of absorptive landscape on the right. These are exclusive, needed to sustain those cities. Tokyo is a particularly ominous example. I think it's a city with an enormous ecological footprint. Tokyo is a city that consists of about 35 million people. Nobody knows quite for sure. About a quarter of the population of Japan. But that city alone requires more productivity to sustain its current relatively modest lifestyles compared to North America than is contained within all of Japan. And it's, as I say, an example of a megapolis that is dependent utterly on the next 50 years looking pretty much like the past 50 years in terms of access to resources. But that's not likely to be the case. This graph is a projection, not a projection, but a reflection of past uses of fossil fuel. It looks like the population curve. This is not an accident. The growth of the human enterprise, the growth of cities, in fact, the modern city is entirely a product of fossil fuel. I shouldn't say entirely, it's obviously not the only factor, but in the absence of abundant, cheap energy, cities could not exist in their current form. And this curve is not, therefore, a reflection of the population growth curve by accident. Fossil energy is behind the growth of the human enterprise. And it's an exponential growth curve, such that in the last 30 years, we've used all of the energy of all the previous periods put together. So if we double again, the next doubling will mean we will use more energy in the next 30 years or 35 years than in all previous periods in history. That's the nature of exponential growth. The problem is that there isn't that energy available. By the way, none of this is models. These are real data that we have to confront, that we are completely ignoring in the development of our ideas about cities today. This is a graph showing both production and consumption of petroleum on the planet. You'll see that the peak period of discovery was in the 1960s. By the early 1980s, consumption began to exceed discovery in every year, and it's been that way ever since. We are now at the point where we can talk seriously about peak oil. For many decades, technological optimists and economists argued it could not happen. Even the International Energy Agency said it was an impossibility. But finally, 2 years ago, in the annual report of the International Energy Agency, they admitted it had in fact happened already. Crude oil reaches an undulating plateau about whatever by 2020, but never again will reach its all-time peak of 70 million barrels per day, which we reached and passed in 2006. This then is their curve projecting into the future. It's a very political organization. It cannot admit to its political masters that energy supplies are in crisis, so it projects a continuing increase of fossil fuel supplies. But if you look carefully at this graph, the blue and gray areas, the light blue and gray areas, represent oil yet to be discovered. So within 30 years, 60% of the global energy supply, at least petroleum supply, is yet to be discovered, and we're not discovering anymore. So this is a significant problem looming on the horizon. There's another shoe about to fall off the bed, and that has to do with general resource scarcity. Recent studies show that about 63 of 69 or 89 or so important minerals are now truly scarce. So for 20 years, prices have been steadily rising. This has stimulated more and more search for these minerals. We're not finding them. And so we've reached the point where prices have increased by several tens to several 100% for these key minerals in the last 20 years, a trend which is likely to continue. One consequence, of course, of consuming all of these resources is the output of waste. Everything that goes into the economic system comes out as waste, everything, 100% of it ultimately. Carbon dioxide is the single largest waste product by weight of industrial economies. It has increased by about 40% in the last 150 years. It is the principal driver, of course, of climate change. So we're confronted by two huge problems, which have so far not really been addressed in this discussion, about densification. The first is, can it continue in the absence of the energy supplies necessary to sustain it? And the main point I would make there is that cities are a product of abundant, cheap energy. They are not sustainable in the absence of abundant, cheap energy. But the ecosphere is not sustainable if we continue to use fossil fuels. We need to find a substitute. As yet, there are no substitutes for fossil fuels, either in terms of the density or convenience of use of that particular group of fuels. So to save themselves, cities must begin dramatically to contribute to the conservation of fossil fuels, at the very least to extend the fossil fuel era while reducing our consumption of those same fuels to avoid the major climate change that's likely to happen. Cities have a huge advantage in terms of sustainability, in terms of what I call the urban sustainability multiplier. We've seen many, many references to this already today. The agglomeration economies of cities make possible recycling, remanufacturing, redistribution, central heating, conurbations of all sorts are hugely savings of energy. Densification is absolutely necessary if we're going to move in the direction that we need to move. Ultimately, and if we were really intelligent, it's already been mentioned several times, that cities aren't even part of the Canadian Constitution in any significant way. It's time to rewrite our entire way of perceiving cities as places where most people live. Provinces have become obsolete, not cities. We need to think in terms of bioregional city-states with highly densified urban cores at the center, designed in the ways we've been talking about to be habitations for people. But these urban cores should be surrounded by much of the supportive landscape needed to sustain those populations at the center. A bioregional city-state then would be largely dependent on the ecosystems within its immediate vicinity. This, by the way, is an impossible goal for most cities, major macro cities on the planet today, but it's not impossible for many cities in Canada. If we're not interested in moving this direction, then we have to confront the other problems that I've talked about here. What if energy really becomes scarce, as most people who study this think it is going to be, and trade becomes less and less possible? At the very least, the costs of everything are going to be going up. We've been shocked recently by the steep rise in fossil fuel prices. Hold on to your hats, you've seen nothing yet. Costs will increase. In many places in the world, the price of food has doubled in the last decade. We'll see that double again. This will create more urban intermigration. If sea levels rise, and now the estimates are up to 3 to 4 meters this year, if you take a worse, or not this year, this century in a worst case scenario, hundreds of millions of ecological refugees who will be seeking new places to live in the cities in the rich countries. How are we really prepared in this country to accept our fair share of refugees in the event that these things occur? And we're on track for a 4-degree increase in mean global temperatures if the current science is correct, and there's every reason to believe that it is. If anything, the IPCC estimates of climate change have been below the mark and below the pace that we've seen in recent years. This is the biophysical context in which urban planning must go forward over the next few decades. The next few decades will not be a simple extension of the last few decades. We must adjust to the biophysical realities within which we find ourselves. Cities to date have evolved in an era when the world was empty. Today, the world is full. We are 50% in overshoot, by which we mean we are using 50% more of the annual productivity of ecosystems and the assimilative capacity of ecosystems on this earth, and that is increasing to the point where it's undermining the very life support systems needed to sustain urban civilization. So let's wake up to that reality and start putting that in our planning handbasket. Thank you.